As Mrs. Henderson walked towards the rusted old car, inside she saw the small, curled-up figure of her student, Timmy, fast asleep in the back seat. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the door handle, a million questions racing through her mind. What was he doing here? Why was he sleeping in this car? And most importantly, how long has this been going on? You won't believe what she discovered next. Keep watching to find out the heartbreaking truth and how one teacher's actions changed everything. But first, if you want to show your support for Timmy and his incredible journey, please leave a like and subscribe. Together, we can bring more attention to children like him and ensure they receive the care and love they deserve. It was a chilly November morning, and the air was crisp with a promise of winter. Mrs. Henderson, an elementary school teacher with over 20 years of experience, arrived at Lincoln Elementary a little earlier than usual. The days were getting shorter, and with the holidays approaching, the school was buzzing with excitement. But something about this particular morning felt different. As Mrs. Henderson parked her car and gathered her teaching supplies, she noticed something strange out of the corner of her eye. A rusted old car parked in the far corner of the school's parking lot. At first, she didn't think much of it. The school had seen plenty of old cars parked nearby, but this one stood out. The windows were fogged up from the inside, and there was something about the way the car seemed to blend into the shadows that made Mrs. Henderson feel uneasy. She shook off the feeling, assuming it was just someone's beat-up vehicle left overnight, and made her way into the building. As the bell rang, signaling the start of another school day, Mrs. Henderson prepared her classroom. She was the kind of teacher who cared deeply about each of her students, always making sure to greet them with a warm smile and a personal question to make them feel seen and valued. Among her students was Timmy, a quiet 7-year-old boy who rarely spoke unless spoken to. He had always been shy and withdrawn, but lately, Mrs. Henderson had noticed a change in his behavior. His clothes were always wrinkled and his shoes, worn down to the soles, seemed too small for his growing feet. Timmy would often come to school without lunch, his hair messy, and sometimes with dark circles under his eyes. But what really caught her attention was that he was always tired, too tired for a 7-year-old. Something was off, and Mrs. Henderson had a gnawing feeling that Timmy was hiding something. Later that day, during recess, Mrs. Henderson stood by the window watching her students play outside. Timmy, as usual, sat alone on a bench watching the other kids with tired eyes. He wasn't running around with the other children, but just sitting there lost in thought. Something inside Mrs. Henderson urged her to keep an eye on him, and that's when she saw it. Timmy, glancing nervously toward the school parking lot. She followed his gaze and saw that same rusted car she had noticed earlier that morning. Timmy's eyes darted back and forth from the car to his classmates, as if he was hiding a secret. Her heart sank. She knew something was terribly wrong. Mrs. Henderson had seen too many children over the years who lived in difficult situations. But this felt different. Timmy wasn't just quiet because he was shy. He was quiet because he was carrying a burden too heavy for someone his age. After school, Mrs. Henderson couldn't shake the image of Timmy glancing at that car. She decided to wait a little longer in her classroom, watching from the window. As the last of the students left, she saw Timmy walking out of the school building. Instead of heading toward the nearby playground or to the bus stop like the others, Timmy made a beeline straight for that old, beat-up car. Mrs. Henderson's heart raced as she watched him open the back door and slip inside. Could it be that Timmy was living in that car? The thought hit her like a ton of bricks. She couldn't believe it, but the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. His disheveled appearance, the constant tiredness, the lack of food, everything pointed to a child who was in a situation far worse than she had imagined. Mrs. Henderson's hands trembled as she picked up her phone, unsure of what to do. Should she call social services? Should she approach Timmy? Should she investigate further? The next day, Mrs. Henderson made it a point to talk to Timmy. She approached him gently during lunch, sitting next to him in the cafeteria where he sat alone, as usual. "Hey, Timmy," she said softly, "I noticed you didn't bring lunch today. Are you feeling okay?" Timmy looked up at her, startled, as if he hadn't expected anyone to notice. He hesitated for a moment before nodding slightly, avoiding her gaze. "Would you like to share my lunch?" Mrs. Henderson offered with a smile. "I brought extra today." Timmy's eyes lit up for a brief moment before he quickly looked away again, nodding silently. As he ate, Mrs. Henderson kept the conversation light, asking him about his favorite books, cartoons, and subjects in school. But all the while, she was trying to figure out how to approach the topic of the car. Finally, after a few minutes of casual conversation, Mrs. Henderson gently asked, "Timmy, do you live far from school? I noticed you walk by yourself in the mornings." Timmy froze. His little hands gripped the sandwich tightly, and he stared at the table. After what felt like an eternity, he whispered, "No." The word hung in the air, and Mrs. Henderson's heart broke as she realized what it meant. Timmy wasn't going to give her more than that, but it was enough to confirm her fears. She decided not to press him further, at least not yet. That evening, Mrs. Henderson couldn't sleep. Her mind kept going back to Timmy, sitting alone in that car after school. How long had he been living like this? Where were his parents? Did anyone else know? She knew she had to do something, but she wasn't sure how to approach the situation without making things worse for Timmy. The next day, Mrs. Henderson arrived at school earlier than usual. She walked around the parking lot and found the car again. This time, she noticed blankets piled in the back seat, a few plastic bags filled with clothes, and empty food wrappers scattered across the floor. It was clear now, Timmy had been living in the car. She felt a knot form in her stomach. How could this have gone unnoticed for so long? That day, Mrs. Henderson made a decision. She couldn't just stand by and do nothing. During lunch, she approached the school counselor, Mr. Williams, and shared her concerns about Timmy. They spoke privately in his office, and as she explained everything she had seen, Mr. Williams' expression turned serious. "We need to do something, but we have to be careful," Mr. Williams said. "We don't want to scare Timmy or make him feel like he's done something wrong. He's probably terrified that someone will take him away." Together, they decided to contact Child Services, but with a plan to help Timmy in the least disruptive way possible. They wanted to make sure he felt safe and supported throughout the process. Mrs. Henderson couldn't shake the guilt she felt, knowing that Timmy had been going through this for who knows how long, and no one had noticed. A week later, social workers arrived at the school, but they didn't take Timmy away right then. Instead, they began investigating his case quietly, speaking to his distant relatives and neighbors. That's when the full story came to light. Timmy's parents had tragically died in a car accident several months ago. He had no close family members to take him in, and rather than end up in foster care, he had been living alone in his parents' car, afraid to ask for help. Mrs. Henderson felt sick to her stomach. She couldn't believe the immense burden Timmy had been carrying on his small shoulders. No child should ever have to go through something like that, she thought. But now that the truth was out, they could finally help him. The social workers, along with Mr. Williams and Mrs. Henderson, put together a plan to get Timmy the care he needed. With the help of the school community, they found him a temporary foster home with a kind family that lived nearby. They made sure Timmy could stay in the same school, surrounded by familiar faces, and Mrs. Henderson promised to be there for him every step of the way. On the day Timmy moved into his new foster home, Mrs. Henderson visited him after school. She brought him a backpack filled with school supplies, some of his favorite books, and a few snacks she knew he liked. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked softly, kneeling down to his level. Timmy nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson," he whispered. "You saved me." Mrs. Henderson hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her own face. "You're going to be okay, Timmy," she said. "You're not alone anymore. You have people who care about you, and we're all here to help." The months that followed were full of ups and downs, but Timmy slowly began to heal. With the support of his new foster family and the teachers who cared about him, he started to thrive. He became more confident in class, made new friends, and began to smile more often. Mrs. Henderson watched with pride as the shy, tired little boy she had once worried about transformed into a happy, healthy child. Looking back on everything that had happened, Mrs. Henderson felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She was grateful that she had noticed the signs, grateful that the school had been able to intervene, and most of all, grateful that Timmy had found a new chance at life. Timmy's story became a reminder to everyone at Lincoln Elementary that sometimes the quietest children have the heaviest burdens. It taught Mrs. Henderson and the entire school the importance of paying attention, of being there for children in need, and of never underestimating the difference one caring adult can make in a child's life. As for Timmy, he continued to grow and thrive, knowing that his teacher had seen him when no one else did. And because of her, His life was changed forever. This powerful story reminds us that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can make the biggest difference. If this story moved you, make sure to leave a comment below with your thoughts and experiences. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video to help spread the message. Together, we can change lives, just like Mrs. Henderson did for Timmy.